Scotland's buildings trace the journey made by the Scots through history. A walk through the streets of historic old Aberdeen reveals the wide range of architectural styles and techniques used through time, as well as revealing the values and ideas underpinning the stone, glass and granite. Architecture helps to define the culture of the age.
Pride in our built heritage is nothing new. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, parts of Scotland experienced something of a mini building boom in luxury houses for the rich. The west of Scotland led the way, with almost half of Glasgow's leading merchants, the so-called tobacco lords, acquiring country houses and estates in this period. The northeast of Scotland had its own version of this grandiose scheme of home improvements. Some of these northeast landed estates were long established properties, developed and extended using new money or by new owners. Aberlour House on Strathspey, Fask House in Angus, Monymusk House and Cluny Castle, both on Donside in Aberdeenshire, and the Burn near Edsall, were all estates of this type. Others were significant new builds, employing influential architects and master tradesmen to make very visible statements about the wealth and the social status of the owners. Cairness House and Criminmogate, both near Fraserburgh in Buchan, fall into this category, as does Powys House, built between 1802 and 1804, very near here in Aberdeen. But the architecture of these fine houses hides as much as it reveals, because behind the dazzling facades and the refined interiors of some of Scotland's finest country houses lies a history of involvement with slavery. Recent research by historians suggests that in the early 19th century, between 5 and 10% of all British country houses had links to Caribbean slavery, with the figure in Scotland likely to be even higher. One such country house was owned by the Leslie family of Old Aberdeen, and this, the Powys Gateway, was built in 1834 as the entranceway to the estate house, Powys House. The shield up on the gateway is said to have been carved by the Leslies to commemorate the 1833 Slave Emancipation Act. It's just possible to see an African face on the very worn and weathered surface. The gateway may have been built using money received by the Leslies in compensation when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834. The British government paid a total of £20 million, about 16 billion at today's prices, to the thousands of British slave owners.
Hugh Fraser Leslie, the owner of the Powys estate, was the recipient of over £6,000 as an owner, creditor or trustee of 5 Jamaican estates. Today, the details of these awards can be viewed in the Legacies of British Slave Ownership website, established and maintained by University College London. The database provides a detailed insight into the individuals who owned slaves in 1834. Many Scots appear in the records. As well as listing the owners of slaves, the database traces the legacies resulting from their compensation windfalls.
The Legacies database is a very recent project by historians, but the slave compensation records themselves have been available to the public since 1913, and one of the very first people to consult them was an Aberdonian, John Malcolm Bulloch. Bulloch was the Aberdeen-born, London-based journalist and prolific author who was fascinated by the Gordon clan and wrote extensively on every aspect of their history and their heritage.
In keeping with his interests, when Bulloch went to the Public Record Office in London in 1913 to search the newly opened compensation files, he searched only for the compensation claims made by slave owners with the surname Gordon. Many of them, of course, Scots. There were over 200 entries in the records.
Bulloch used the information from his researches in the Public Record Office to write a short account of the Gordons as colonists in the West Indies. Writing in 1915, at the height of Britain's imperial power, there was no hint of embarrassment at revealing the role of Scots like the Gordons in the slave economies of the Caribbean. But we live in very different times, and as the evidence mounts up about the central role of Scots in West Indian slavery, we're forced to confront a very uncomfortable past. And it's a past that's at odds with how we Scots often like to see ourselves. It's an uncomfortable thought that evidence of Scotland's slavery past has been hiding in plain sight all along. One northeast family with links to slavery was the Gordon family of Butthlaw and Cairness. They were minor gentry in Aberdeenshire, but in the late 18th century their fortunes were transformed as a result of wealth partly derived from the West Indies. When he became the first laird of Cairness in 1776, Charles Gordon inherited the sugar plantation of Georgia in the Trelawney parish of Jamaica. In 1783, he built himself a new house here at Cairness, but by 1789 he had developed ambitions on a much grander scale and wanted to replace it. He asked the renowned architect James Playfair to draw designs for the construction of a new magnificent country house. And here it is, Cairness House.
Cairness House was built between 1791 and 1797 to Playfair's plans and designs. Today, the house is regarded as a neoclassical masterpiece at the cutting edge of architectural design of the time. The semicircular court at the rear of the building, for example, was based upon the latest French designs. Internally, Playfair added new features too, including an Egyptian-themed room, the very first of its type to be completed in Britain.
Playfair also submitted designs for these lodge gates, although it would take a century before a Gordon descendant would build them using Playfair's original designs. We don't know what the exact cost of actually building Cairness House was, but the Reverend Charles Gibbon, who was minister here at Lunmay Parish Church and a close personal friend of Thomas Gordon, Charles Gordon's son, believed it to be £25,000, about 2 million at today's prices. But whatever the price paid by Gordon, the real cost of Cairness was much higher, because it included the suffering of the slave population on Charles Gordon's sugar plantation on Jamaica.
Jamaica was at the heart of the British plantation system. It became the West Indies' biggest sugar producer, and Charles Gordon was one of its absentee slave owners. His plantation was run by his factor, Francis Grant, who had family links to Strathspey. George's exports of rum and sugar were sent to London and occasionally to Glasgow. Some Aberdeen street names clearly link the city to trade with the Americas. There's no evidence that despite the Gordon links to Aberdeenshire, produce from his plantation was ever landed here at Aberdeen.
Georgia plantation became very profitable. In 1 year alone, in 1790, it produced 206 hogsheads of sugar. These were the giant wooden barrels used for transporting sugar. Charles Gordon's factor, Francis Grant, informed him in a letter that his sugar crop for that year was worth the amazing sum of £5,762 sterling, the equivalent of £500,000 at today's values. Profits like this from Jamaica would help to finance the building of Cairness House.
The profits from Georgia were not Gordon's only source of finance. The rents from his Aberdeenshire estates, Bufflaw, Cairness and Newtile, would also have played an important part in funding the building work. Charles Gordon also had a share of salmon fishings at the mouth of the Dee in Aberdeen. His marriage to Christian Forbes of Balogie in 1783 also linked him to a wealthy landed family on Deeside.
But Georgia was the jewel in the crown. In 1791, when Gordon's estates were worth £42,000, Georgia was valued at £25,000. After purchasing Georgia, Gordon gradually became confident that his family's fortunes were secure. In 1790, he commissioned Henry Raeburn, Scotland's foremost portrait painter, to paint portraits of himself and his wife Christian. These paintings can now be seen in the National Trust for Scotland's Fyvie Castle. The Gordons of Cairness had joined the North East's rich list of the time. And what about the lives of the slaves who laboured on Gordon's plantation? Georgia State records form part of the Cairness and Bufflaw papers held in the special collections of the University of Aberdeen Library just behind me here. The voices of the slaves are absent in the papers, but some of the letters and accounts of their owner and factor reveal a fleeting glimpse of the lives of the men, women and children who produced Georgia's sugar and allowed the Gordons to enjoy their luxurious lifestyle. Until the Slave Emancipation Act of 1833, Georgia's slaves were treated as their owner's property or chattel and were reduced to little more than beasts of burden. An annual return for 1788 lists the names of all of Georgia's slaves, as well as their jobs and their state of health. As well as Greek and Roman names initially given by owners to male slaves, slaves were also named after Scottish towns and cities. Occasionally we see an African name, here Cuffy. The name is actually Kofi, from the Ashanti Kingdom of modern Ghana. Kofi's employment was as a cooper, making the barrels which would transport the sugar. Women's names are more conventional: Rose, Phyllis, Susanna, Hannah. Another rare African name is Mimba, also possibly Ashanti from modern Ghana. Mimba's job was to look after the hens, and she is described as old and weakly. It's deeply disturbing to see the records of the enslaved in Georgia side by side with an inventory of stock. In the section of the record for slaves in 1822, we read for January the 2nd, Sophie, delivered of a female child named Jean. While just below on the same page, the entry for May the 15th reads, Sally dropped a bull calf named Minto. And in the section on deaths, we read of Anna, a child died of debility, while the section on stock records that Taylor, a mule, died in the pasture. The births and deaths of the enslaved were recorded in the same manner as the estate's animals.
Georgia's records give only the barest details of lives blighted by slavery. Escape from slavery through manumission, the purchase of freedom from the slave owner, was the experience of only a tiny minority.
Sometimes the Georgia records, as terse and as brief as they are, reveal the enormous bravery of the enslaved. In the records of the decrease in slaves for 1832 are the names of 5 slaves: Edward Grant, John Bailey, John Kelly, Robert Lamont and Thomas Reed. They had been tried by court-martial and given lifetime sentences in the workhouse for acts of rebellion. The men were almost certainly supporters of the 1831 slave uprising on Jamaica, led by Samuel Sharp. And 2 more names will shortly be removed from the Georgia slave lists. Daphne and Hawk, aged 65 and 75 respectively, both described as runaways for many years, are now presumed to be dead. At the heart of the Georgia state was a business model in which slaves, like stock, were expendable. It must have been an exhausting, dangerous and daily battle to resist the dehumanizing regime of the plantation.
Slavery created enormous wealth, but it was not just planters and merchants or their lawyers and factors who benefited. The Aberdeenshire tradesmen who built Cairness House and the local workers who quarried its granite benefited too. The profits of the slave system permeated society, encompassing the weavers who supplied the clothing worn by Georgia's slaves and the Northeast's fishermen whose salted herring was sent to Jamaica to feed them. When the British Parliament finally abolished slavery in 1834 and provided £20 million in compensation to the slave owners, Charles Gordon's son, Thomas Gordon, received £5,296 compensation for the ownership of 266 slaves. This is worth around £500,000 at today's values.
After the Slave Emancipation Act of 1833, Charles Gordon's son, Thomas, continued to own Georgia, but its profits never reached the heights of the late 18th century when his father had owned the estate. Thomas Gordon's son, James Wilkinson Gordon, continued to own Georgia, and he was clearly proud of his West Indian property. When he died in 1886, his gravestone, which is here, described him as of Cairness and Georgia, Jamaica. But the plantation's fortunes continued to decline, and eventually it was sold in 1894 by Charles Gordon's great-grandson for £7,500. The link between Cairness House and Georgia was finally ended, almost exactly a century after it had begun. Today, Cairness House is a private home which has no links to the Gordon family who originally built it and is not open to the public. It's a visible reminder of the historical links that connect many country houses in northeast and many parts of Scotland to slavery. Exploring the West African and Caribbean dimensions of this history can only help us to gain a better understanding of our common shared heritage and the implications this has for all of us.